Welcome back, Asian patrons of the arts of the Vatican Museums. I'm Liz Lepp.
And I'm Thomas Williams.
And here we are at part 3 in our lecture series. And today we're going to be exploring with Father Michael Collins the area of Chateauneuf-du-Pape and the rich history of the wines there.
A lot of you have had Rhone wines before. This is from the Rhone Valley, divided into the northern and the southern. Chateauneuf-du-Pape is in the southern part of this. It's got a very rich history for us as a Catholic Church, as you're going to hear about later today, because the papacy was actually moved there for about a century. But we're going to focus today on the wines.
And so we're going to be taking a wine from the northern part and the southern part and sort of bringing together this area in a sort of very happy red and white encounter.
You know, a lot of people don't like Rhone wines at the beginning. It takes some getting used to, but once you've fallen for them, it's some of the best wine in the world. And there are two things that really stand out. We're going to see if my wine holds up. Yours is going to have some different notes. But you get in these Rhone wines, and particularly in Chateauneuf-du-Pape, a lot of earthiness and a lot of spice. And those are things that are very fun. It's not just about the fruit, it's about these other elements that are so characteristic and so wonderful.
It goes very, very well with the rich, wonderful cooking and cuisine from that part of France as well.
So without further ado, why don't we show and tell and talk about these wines?
So I have decided to go north, and I am going to be taking you to the area in the area called Condrieu, which means le coin de ruisseau, the corner of the brook, and so it's named for its geographical area. And this particular area around the Rhone vinifies only white wine, 100% Viognier. And so I will be introducing you, or perhaps reacquainting you, with this white wine, 100% Viognier grape called Condrieu.
I am going to take you to a classic Chateauneuf-du-Pape. This is from 2016. Chateauneuf-du-Pape is allowed to use up to 13 different types of grapes, but in reality nowadays, 3 are completely predominant. Grenache, which is number 1, making up 50 to 70% of the grape in all Chateauneuf-du-Pape wines, and then Syrah and Mourvèdre. So much so that you'll sometimes call these the GSM wines because of that. And this wine is very typical in that regard. It has those 3 in almost those same proportions. It's 57% Grenache, another 12% Syrah, and the rest is the Mourvèdre today.
This wine is actually a very ancient wine. We know that during the period of ancient Rome, the Romans began to use this area of France to produce wine. So Viognier was actually a wine that was in circulation around the Roman Empire. So we have a little bit of history in our glass, as well as all of the fascinating bouquet and tasting notes that this wine brings. Shall we start with a looking at it? Now, the wines from Condrieu tend to be a little bit more golden colored. They're a little bit more intense in flavor, and their coloring tends to be less straw, and it moves more towards a gold or a topaz.
The Chateauneuf-du-Pape wines are much deeper, richer color than, for example, we had last week with the Pinot Noir. This is something where if you like a more bold and hearty wine, you're definitely in the right place, which is why it's often paired with things like game and things that require a little bit more rough and tough. And
the bouquet of a Condrieu is extremely different from what we talked about in Burgundy last week. The bouquet is much more floral, and as a matter of fact, it gets to these flowers that are that sort of deep, heady scent of honeysuckle or magnolia. It's a very, very strong floral scent on the nose.
Whereas we've moved, last week we had more wild berries, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries. This is much plummier on the fruit side. There's some violet on the floral, and there's an awful lot of spice in that earth that you get. There's balsamic again. We had a little bit of that in our very first wine, and a little bit of eucalyptus. You get this interesting menthol going on as well, which gives it, again, a very rich combination of flavors.
Now, when it comes to the flavor of the Condrieu, like the Meursault last week, it does have that very round mouthfeel At the same time, it still also, it has some of the acidity that helps to dissipate it. However, we often find that in the Condrieu, there are some winemakers who choose not to make the wine undergo the malolactic fermentation. And that's when the acid that is called malolactic acid, it comes from the word apple. That's why often white wine tastes like apple. It's a little bit tart. That's the tartar type of wine, the acidic type of acid, and it undergoes a fermentation so that changes into lactic acid, which is much more milky and buttery, like the word lactic, lactose coming from milk. And so we find that malolactic fermentation is very present in the Burgundy wines. We get that sort of much more buttery flavor. In this case, it's a much rounder, but it tends to have a little bit more of a brighter citrus backbone.
This wine that I was just tasting is absolutely delicious, but unlike last week's wine that was standing by itself and you could just spend hours sniffing it and tasting it, this is crying out for a good hearty meal. This makes me want a roasted pheasant or some venison or something to stand up to this very bold, bright wine. But it's absolutely delicious, and we hope that these wines also help give greater sense and greater richness to the question of the history, the art of this region you're about to explore.
And with the Condrieu, I would suggest very strongly that this is an opportunity to use a white wine for much more richer and complex dishes, because of the fact that it's got such a powerful floral, citrus, nutty, spicy nose that it really can stand up to a lot more variations of flavor. So it'd be fun to experiment with this. At any rate,
enjoy your lecture. Cheers.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. My name is Richard Hoon, and I'm your moderator today. I'm from Singapore. And for this third session of the series of 5 on faith, art, and wine. I'm a Christian lover of art, and of course, lover of wine as well, and I'm happy to participate in this session today, particularly because I have visited Chateauneuf-du-Pape and Avignon. My sister was married there, so it brings back great memory from my visit there. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Father Michael, and also enjoying the lecture together with you. I'm involved in some charity work with the Center for Fathering for over 13 years, and stepped down last year and became honorary chairman to eradicate fatherlessness, and also a chairman of Crew Asia, a Christian missional organization to help fulfill the Great Commission for our Lord, and also through our seminary called the East Asia School of Theology, where we train pastors and missionaries for the field. My interest in food and wine also extend to a society which I've joined, and I'm the commander and former chancellor of it. It's called the Chaîne de Rôtisserie, the Bailliage of Singapore. And I'm pleased that we drank a lot of Chateauneuf-du-Pape wine, in addition to other Burgundy and Bordeaux wine as well as New World wine. We are pleased to welcome our Hong Kong chapter of the APAVM, who is having an art and wine benefit dinner this afternoon. The lecture will be Zoom live to them at the Square Restaurant, and I think they are already having a good time. We can see an image of them drinking and meeting together as well, while we are all in our own little home as well. So on behalf of the Asian chapter of the Patron of the Arts in the Vatican Museum, let me welcome today's lecture series on Pope Clement V and a wine of Chateauneuf-du-Pape, featuring Father Michael Collins. In 1305, Clement V was elected Pope, and he moved the papal seat from Rome to Avignon. A series of popes reigned in the French town until Pope Gregory IX returned the papacy to Rome in 1376. So Father Michael will focus on this 7 decades of the Pope's reign in Avignon, and also covering the Gothic-style papal palace. It's very similar, that inspired the Notre Dame in Paris, and also been decorated by a series of famous Tuscan painters, notably Simone Martini in Avignon, but also the likes of Michelangelo in the Sixtine Chapel and Leonardo da Vinci with the Mona Lisa. So unfortunately, we can't see those beautiful images as they were all destroyed during the war. The papal residence was the scene of sumptuous banquet and vineyard. And of course, the most celebrated and still being produced today is the famed Chateauneuf-du-Pape wine, or the wine of the new castle of the Pope. This lecture will explore the papacy at Avignon, especially with the two popes, not the movie, The Two Popes, as Father Michael will expound for us later on, the work of art, the architecture of the Papal Palace, and the development of Burgundy viticulture. So let me introduce you Father Michael. Father Michael is the priest of the Archdiocese of Dublin and has taught history, art, and culture in a number of universities in Rome. A native of Ireland, Father Michael also studied art, archaeology, and is also a best-selling author and has written and edited 15 award-winning books, which has been translated to 13 languages. His most recent, which I had the benefit of introducing last year, was Raphael's World, which was published to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the death of the celebrated Renaissance artist. His upcoming book will be published in October next year, called The Lost Masterpieces by Dorling Kinsella Publication, which will cover 90 works of art that were destroyed or stolen. Father Michael is featured in various international TV shows and has also appeared in 60 Minutes. We are most honored and happy to have him speak with us. Now we have almost 100 people from all over the world attending today's seminar, so your sound and video has been turned off to minimize distraction. If you'd like to watch today's lecture again, we'll circulate them to you via YouTube link at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I will try to accommodate as much question as possible. They will permit us at the end of Father Michael's address. Do not worry if your questions are not answered during the session, as we will forward them to Father Michael, who will then reply to you via email separately. So without further ado, let me hand over you to Father Michael Collins.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. I'm delighted to see everybody and to join you for our visit today, which is going to go on a tour within 70 years. So I have to be quite quick and to move fairly rapidly. So what I thought I would do would be to explain a little bit about the history of Avignon, which took place over the period of 7 decades. Now, I'm one of the unusual Irish people who doesn't drink much. So in a sense, I would not be so expert at talking about the wine. But I'd like to explain a little bit about the reason why the popes moved to Avignon. France and England were engaged in a near permanent conflict in territories. To finance the war at the beginning of the 14th century, strict taxes were imposed by the French. In particular, the clergy were levied. The new Pope, Boniface VIII, was indignant that the king, Philip the Fair, who had reigned since 1385, should interfere and condemned him roundly. Nobody but the Pope, he reminded the sovereign, had permission to impose taxes. The church had long condemned usury, the taking of interest on a loan, in theory, if not in practice. Christians had therefore avoided banking activity, which had become the property now of the Jews. Rome became the center of international trading in luxuries. The popes relaxed the restrictions on Christians and commerce. So we have a Pope, Boniface VIII, who'd been elected in 1294, after Pope Celestine V had unexpectedly retired or abdicated after just 4 months of a pontificate, a short period. So now the Pope, Boniface, and King Philip were engaged in hostile activities. And the problem really was over money. The king wanted the clergy's money because the clergy had amassed over 1,000 years a huge amount of money. They'd collected artworks, they'd collected money, they'd bought land, so they were great wealthy landowners. And when you think of it, the king of France would not want this happening. Boniface was furious and confiscated most of the Colonna properties. The Colonna family accused Boniface of murdering the former Pope Celestine. It was just the turn of the century. The end of one century, beginning into the other, was often accompanied by events importance in the popular mind. And around that period, in the year 1300, an old man and his son had come to Rome, claiming that if every 100 years people would come to the city of Rome, they would receive a blessing from the Pope and forgiveness of all their sins, which would ensure their speedy entry into eternity. And so this was the world in which we lived at that time. Boniface then died in 1302. The new pope was elected. So the popes had to continue on. The cardinals were now divided into two camps. There were principally French and also there were principally Italians. So these were the two. So they decided that they would elect a Frenchman, and the man who took the name was Clement the Fifth. The new Pope, Clement, elected in 1305, reigned until 1314 and was to spend 8 years of his pontificate in the shadow of the new king. News traveling across the Alps suggested that a French Pope would not be welcome in Rome. It was too violent. So King Philip wisely suggested that maybe the new Pope would like to be crowned in Lyon. And you can see the city of Lyon indicated above the blue balloon on our map. As a temporary measure, the new Pope took up residence in the southern town of Avignon, which is marked by our blue sign. And no Pope would set foot in Rome again for over 70 years. Clement was entirely in King Philip's power, giving in to his desire to hold a church council and even defaming the memory of Pope Boniface VIII in his intemperate bull, Rex Gloriae. The greatest shame for Clement was his suppression of the Knights Templar, established by the First Crusaders as a monastic military order to safeguard the shrines of Palestine from the Muslim invaders. Little over 2 centuries had passed since the French knights had been urged by Pope Urban II to drive out Muslim invaders from the Holy Land in 1095. In the process, many of these entrepreneurs had become wealthy landowners and bankers. Their newly acquired riches had not gone down well in feudal France. Everyone had a predetermined place in society and was expected to stay there. On the night of the 13th of October, 1307, King Philip moved against the Knights Templar. In swift and vicious raids throughout the kingdom, the knights were rounded up and arrested. No reason was given to the prisoners, and months, even years of torture ensued. Philip and his agents used the most sophisticated instruments available to extract confessions from the knights who had risked their lives to fight the fierce Muslims. Racks, thumb screws, head clamps, sizzling charcoal beds, red-hot irons gave them what they wanted. From the depths of the dungeons, the knights screamed their confessions. Yes, they had uttered blasphemies, spat on holy images and crosses. They confessed whatever they wanted their torturers to hear. Those who failed to do so had their tongues cut out. Philip persuaded the Pope that a council would be the only way of dealing with these heretics. And he wrote in March 1312, he said, "Your beatitude is where that I have been informed by trustworthy people of the results of inquiries into the brethren and order of the Knights Templar. These reveal that they committed such great heresies and other dreadful, detestable crimes that for this reason the order should be justifiably suppressed." Pope Clement in Avignon gave in. Lands, castles, goods, jewelry, all were confiscated and given to the Hospitaliers of St. John of Jerusalem, a similar, if not rival, monastic military organization. But in effect, all the properties fell now to the French crown. In 1314, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake. As his body was consumed by the flames, he called on God to justify him and avenge his death. Both Pope and King were to die within the next year. Of course, it's no consolation to know that those who died were justified later by historians who proved that all the allegations were unfair. The next 6 popes who took up residence in Avignon were all French. They had little desire to exchange the tranquil surrounding of Avignon for the foul-smelling streets of Rome. At Avignon, under the protection of the French crown, they came to be regarded as monarchs in their own right. And in this bird's-eye view of the modern-day town, we can see how large it was to spread under papal influence. We see Pope Benedict, who decided in 1338 to build himself a palace worthy for a pope, dismantling all that the sycophantic bishops who had made their home at the papal court returned to their diocese. In its stern walls rose up in the midst of the town and all around a bureaucracy to service the needs of the Vicar of Christ. A decade later, Pope Clement the Sixth, who reigned for 10 years between 1342 and 1352, bought the city and the surrounding countryside on the side of the Rhone River from Queen Joanna of Naples for 80,000 ducats. The popes had withstood any appeals from the Romans to return to the city of Rome, and whatever thoughts they may have harbored were dashed in 1347 with the outbreak of the bubonic plague, the Black Death. And therefore, the popes, who are now safely ensconced in the city of Avignon, decided to remain there. In October of 1348, Italian merchants returning from a trading mission to the Black Sea landed in Sicily. When the ship docked in the port, most of the crew were dead. The corpses were piled high on the harbor walls and burned, their ashes swept in to the sea. The plague, transmitted by fleas in the coat of rats, manifested in boils and lesions. Within days, the plague has spread throughout Italy. During the winter months, it seemed to recede, but it continued in the following spring. And within a year, 1/3 of the population of Europe was dead from the terrible plague. For survivors, the harsh conditions seemed relentless. There were not enough healthy people to tend to the crops, which themselves shriveled up and died. When laborers demanded higher wages for extra work that they were asked to do, the landlords refused. And so listen to this contemporary account, which gives us a flavor of the grim conditions all over Europe in the middle of the 14th century. Realizing what a deadly disaster had come to them, the people quickly drove the Italians from their cities, writes our contemporary reporter. But the disease remained, and soon death was everywhere. Fathers abandoned their sick sons. Lawyers refused to come and make out wills for the dying. Friars and nuns were left to care for the sick, and monasteries and convents were soon deserted, as they too were stricken. Bodies were left in empty houses, and there was no one to give them a Christian burial. The city itself, and we continue for a few slides now, the continuing beauty of this town was obviously preferable to Rome, and the popes had several reasons for staying here. They were now the owners of the city. They were able to build what they wanted. They had transferred, if you like, the pilgrim route, which normally would take people to the city of Rome, to the palaces of Avignon. And they wanted to live here by the side of the Rhone River because it was far more comfortable. And they now had their own courtiers. King Philip had died in 1314, so he was no longer part of the threats to the papacy. Philip is depicted here on our left-hand side, and Boniface, very unhappily, the man who had stood up to him and threatened excommunication is depicted on our right-hand side. Philip, in a sense, won the shorter battle, but the papacy won the longer battle. So Avignon was a provincial town that dated back from Roman times, and its patron saint was Saint Martial, who, according to tradition, was a follower of Saint Peter. The original palace belonging to the Bishop of Avignon had been begun in 1254 and had been completed within about 15 to 18 years. But when the popes moved to Avignon, the city of Avignon in 1309, and remained there for the following 7 decades, they decided to build their own new palace. So Pope Benedict XII, who's the third pope, commissioned Pierre de la Rouve and Jean Maupeou to build a new papal residence. And these are now called the two residences, the old residence and the new residence, the old palace or the new palace. So in the old palace, we have the huge consistory hall, which was the hall where the Pope would meet with the cardinals and the ambassadors and the monarchs who would come to him. And he summoned from Tuscany Matteo da Giovinazzi, who was one of the most important of the painters of the middle 14th century. And above the hall, above the consistory hall, is an enormous feasting hall, which was extraordinarily important. And allow me read for you a little bit of what happened in the feasting hall. In November 1324, on the occasion of the marriage of his great niece, Pope John the 22nd invited 300 guests, and the meal included 9 oxen, 55 sheep, 8 pigs, 4 wild boars, 200 capons, 690 chickens, 3,000 eggs, 580 partridges, 270 rabbits, 40 plovers, 37 ducks, 59 pigeons, 4 cranes, 2 pheasants, 2 peacock, 292 small birds, 300 weight of cheese, 200 apples and other fruit, and all washed down with 11 barrels of Chateauneuf-du-Pape wine. So perhaps the critics of the Pope had some reason. So if we move through these slides one by one more quickly, we just see a little glimpse of what present-day Avignon is like. I was there 3 years ago and I spent a week. It's a beautiful town. You can see still the old mill, which continues to generate power from the little streams that run by as tributaries from the Rhone. So we come to our 7 popes of Avignon, and these are just depictions of the popes. Because we have only a limited amount of time, I'm just going to go briefly through the highlights which each of the popes made. So we move forward. Who were these popes? So we started, as I mentioned, with Pope Clement V, who had been elected in 1305 and reigned until 1314. He was the one who moved from Lyon. He was French. He moved from Lyon down to Avignon. And he was the one who suppressed the Knights Templar. He was succeeded by Pope John the 22nd, who laid down the foundation of the vineyards of the famous Chateauneuf-du-Pape. After that came Pope Benedict XII, who began the papal palace in 1338-39, followed by Pope Clement VI, who had a 10-year reign, and he was followed by Pope Innocent VI, who also had a 10-year reign. So they had quite long reigns. And remember, an important thing in those days, the average age of life was about 40 years. So most of these people didn't have long lives. We don't read of people dying in their 80s or 90s. Most of the people that we're discussing in the Middle Ages were already dead by 50. And then the last of the popes, whom we're going to come to in a few moments in more detail, was Pope Urban V, who transferred the papacy once more back to Rome. So Clement was elected. He was crowned by King Philip the Fair, the King of France, which of course meshed the two relations, the temporal and the spiritual. And it made an alliance, an unhappy alliance, which I think the papacy suffered for. And of course, it was Clement who agreed on the king's request, if not insistence, to the suppression of the Knights Templar. And interestingly, Clement was the first pope to send a mission to Rome, from Rome to Beijing. John the 22nd, the second of the popes, planted the great vineyard. He was a great connoisseur of wine, but why did he put so much effort into wine? Well, the reason was not simply for celebrating Mass, as you could imagine. It was because he intended on having a vast palace and curia and officials, which would be commensurate, if not a rival, to the French kings. So for the popes, it was very important to keep up their appearances. They were the monarchs, they were the representatives of God on earth. So therefore, even though Jesus had lived a humble life, they regarded 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years afterwards, that they should live the best life in order to represent or to reflect God's glory. Now today, this is very much an alien thought, and we think entirely, if you contrast Pope Francis, who travels around in a very small car, who makes no fuss about his movements, contrast that back 1,000 years to the time that we're examining. So again, this is our view. If we were coming up visiting the Papal Palace, this is coming from a side street. And if you imagine 800-900 years ago, coming on this enormous, big, forbidding palace, it must have been a very imposing place. And there were courtiers running around. There were people, first of all, the place had to be built. It took them really about 40 years to build, but the main bulk of the building was built, I'd say, within 23 years. And it was a defensive building. You can imagine that the popes were always afraid of being attacked by the kings or maybe other monarchs who might be involved in war, because all of Europe was involved in political turmoil at the time. So in 1340, we find the building of the great palace, and the palace itself had to be paid for. So where did the money come from? Part of it was in selling relics of the saints, remnants of the saints, and selling indulgences. And indulgences were to rear their ugly heads. Again, of course, a century later, at the time of Martin Luther, who made fun of the papacy and mocked it for selling false relics and selling indulgences, real estate, if you like, to get people into the next world. And everybody who bought a papal office, a bishopric or a cardinal's hat, etc., had to pay the Pope. So all of this was funneled into the channels of the papacy. And I remember when I was in Avignon, I was astonished to see, unfortunately, the palace itself is now quite bare, as we'll see in a few moments. The palace itself has been more or less robbed of all its furniture, especially during the time of the Napoleonic Wars at the end of the 18th century. But a bird's eye view would show us what the place looked like. So we could enter in and we'd see the building itself is not enormous. It looks much bigger and imposing from the outside. But all of this, nevertheless, had to be paid for. And when I was in the papal palace, I was astonished to see that underneath the ground, underneath the floor, the popes had installed enormous big chests, and maybe this isn't the thing to be talking about during a fundraising for the Asian patron supporters of the Vatican museums, but the popes had installed large iron chests in order to keep money, jewelry, precious stones, etc. I remember in those days, there were no banks. You couldn't deposit your money in a bank. It was too unsafe. So the banking system was only beginning. It was going to begin, we'll see, in Northern Europe and in Florence. But at the time of Avignon, it hadn't. So this was the equivalent of keeping all your money under the bed. So this was the elevation, and our next slide will show you the various parts of the palace as it looked in an architect's elevation. So you will notice that there are several towers, and all of these are defensive towers. The windows are quite small, and you might notice there's two styles of windows, which we'll see in a moment again. There's the Gothic window, the arched window, and then there's the square block window. But most of all, if you notice, it's masonry, because again, this place was a place of defense. The popes were in a foreign land. This was not their home territory. This was the loggia from which the Pope would appear on Easter and Christmas morning in order to give his blessing to the masses. Inside the papal courtyard, this is where the lucky people, I suppose, or where the workers of the popes would spend their day. You'll see it's a very imposing architecture. It's a very imposing style. It doesn't look very sumptuous from the outside. And so we have to go inside to get a glimpse of what it was like. So even if an army managed to break through the main door, they would nevertheless have to work their way into the palace in order to get into the part where the Pope and his curia and his cardinals lived. But all of this is still visible. So when you visit Avignon, you'll be able to see the palace as it is. It's open to the public, and indeed is the 10th most visited part of France. And this is an example on our left-hand side of a typical door, which has never been replaced. So this door is about 800 years old. It's sturdy oak door, which is studded with iron and bolted, and would require 2 or 3 keys in order to open. And again, we look on the right-hand side, this is typical of the Gothic architecture. And going up these steps, there were no elevators, so you had to be reasonably fit to keep going. Our next slide, please. So Clement VI was the most extravagant of all the popes of the Avignon period, and he almost bankrupted the papal treasury. Think about it, he was the patron of the papacy. He owned, if you like, the papacy, and the papacy was now based in the French city of Avignon. So Rome was falling into disrepair at the same time, while the popes were plowing in money from pilgrims and other resources into the building and beautifying of the city of Avignon. This is our entrance into the chapel, and what a wonderful entrance. And also keep in mind, this is the time of the great cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals of France, Notre Dame, Reims, Amiens. All the great cathedrals were rising at this time, and architects in France were the masters of the Gothic style. No other country came close to them. And they were the ones who devised this Gothic arch, which rose up in a point and allowed the dispersal of the weight of the building, so that later on they were able to open larger windows, such as on the left-hand side, and these windows allowed in light. It meant also that because they had buttresses outside propping up the wall, they were able to develop a magnificent work in stained glass window. In fact, we saw that on our last year's lectures when we went to the cathedrals of France, and we saw the artists were able to insert polychrome, different colors of glass into the windows, and they spattered the walls and spattered the ground with these wonderful colors. But again, look how thick the defensive walls were. And again, it's just to underline that the papacy was always the guest of the French king. I was fascinated to see in this window shot, the window, the piece of glass at the center, looking down into the town, is a modern piece, but the older glass on the left-hand side, according to my guide, was the glass which was inserted there during the building period in the middle of the 14th century. So there's not many places in the world which have preserved glass in situ until the present day. Now, the poet Petrarch went to Rome and he complained to the Pope that this was not the way to live. And he said that he was living in France, in the Babylon of the West. And he complained that the original popes were the successors of poor fishermen of Galilee. And he said that those poor fishermen had lived a frugal sustenance from the Lake of Galilee, where they just took what they need for the day. But now the successors of the fishermen of Galilee were living a licentious life filled with banquets. So instead of pilgrimages, they were now shod with gold. And he called on God to destroy this town and make the popes by any manner return to Rome. But the popes were not willing to leave their beautiful palace. They wanted to stay. Why would they leave all that they had built? Because as far as they were concerned, the papacy would never return to Rome. The shrines of Peter and Paul could remain there in the city, but the popes themselves would now, as far as the foreseeable future was concerned, and indeed possibly for all eternity, would remain in Rome, in Avignon. Now, unfortunately, much of the artwork has been destroyed. And again, as patrons of the arts of the Vatican Museums, our job is to help the restoration and the maintenance and preservation of the artwork. And this is an example of what can happen if things are not cared for. Indeed, the blank walls that we saw a few moments ago were principally painted and decorated in the past, but all the stucco work has fallen off. But here we have a few examples in the next few slides, which we can see, of stucco work by the Tuscan artist. This is Matteo de Giovanetti, who worked in Avignon in the middle of the 14th century. And another great Italian painter, Simone Martini, who also worked at the same period. They had been summoned by the popes in Rome because even though this was France, they realized that the best artists of the period were in Tuscany and in Italy. So here we have Saint Martial meeting the poor and working his miracles, and Saint Peter handing on the baton or the pastoral staff of authority to Saint Martial. So as you can see, much of this artwork has been badly damaged over the centuries. The faces have almost fallen off. And that is because all of this was painted on wet plaster. The colors, the pigments on the paintbrushes went into the plaster and set. They traveled into the plaster. But obviously, over the centuries, humidity, etc., has made the plasterwork fall into powder and fall to the ground. And that's why it's so important to preserve these works of art. And it's an expensive job, but it's so worthwhile because we preserve these for centuries to come, for generations to enjoy. And that's why we're so proud to be patrons of the arts of the Vatican Museums. The Pope's bedroom on the left-hand side was simply decorated with this enormous vine scroll. So maybe a reference to the vineyards, which were outside a few miles of the city of Avignon. And on the right-hand side, a hunting scene. This is called the Stag Room. It's one of the private apartments of the papal palace. And it just shows a rustic scene of a young man climbing a tree and a stag out hunting. These three miniatures, one after the other, just shows a little glimpse of 14th century illuminated manuscripts, which were made at the time of the Avignon papacy. And these were made for the popes in Avignon. And again, I love looking at these old manuscripts because remember, today we have mobile phones, computers, etc., which will show us any amount of images, billions of images in wonderful pixels. But all of these were handmade, hand-painted, or hand-carved. And this, if you like, this and the illustrations we're going to see in a few moments, if we can move forward, are snapshots, if you like, of what the world was like in the middle of the 14th century. So these were books of devotion that the popes would have held in their chapel and would have prayed. It looks quite simple, but these are works of art of great quality, and they allow us almost a contemporary vision of what life in the 14th century was like. Here's one of the good rooms, the good chapels, which has been preserved. And again, it gives you a global view of some of the images we saw a few moments ago in detail. So again, you can ask yourself, why would the popes want to leave Rome? It was a happier place. Although strangely to say, they decided that they would go back to Rome for a short period. The papal court did move in 1366 when Pope Urban V, who had been elected in 1362, decided to return to Rome. And from the city, he hoped to launch a new campaign against the Turks, the Muslims, and make an overture to reconcile the Greek, the Orthodox Church. So astride a white charger, the Pope, in full vestments and under the protection of his guard, entered Rome through the Lateran Gate. He was horrified to see the ruins of the Cathedral of St. John Lateran, which had been burned to the ground 6 years earlier. The papal palace at the Lateran was uninhabitable. The procession crossed the river and made its way out of the city walls to the Vatican, where the apostolic palace lay beside St. Peter's. Here, close to the tomb of St. Peter, the Pope took up his residence. But Rome presented a miserable sight in contrast with the Pope's memory of Avignon. Deprived of papal order and patronage for almost 70 years, brigands and mob rule had both depleted the population and empowered the remaining citizens. Cows and sheep grazed amid the ruins of the Forum. In the Colosseum, the Frangipan family had built a fortress. Urban brought much needed money from the coffers of Avignon and set about restoring the city. But it was brief and unhappy. And after 5 months, the French members of his court persuaded him to go back to the relative tranquility of Avignon. And so the Pope decided that he would, even though he had been asked on different occasions, most notably, or the popes, I should say, most notably by Cola de Rienzo, who had come to Rome in the middle of the 14th century, asking the Pope to return to Rome. But when the popes returned, and as we saw, Pope Urban made that brief period of 5 months back to Rome, it was an unhappy period. And they returned to Avignon. So here we come now just to briefly examine the vineyards of Avignon. It was John the 22nd, I should say, who decided to set out these vineyards for the two reasons. One, obviously, to have sufficient wine for the masses, which were celebrated throughout the city. And keep in mind also, in those days, there was no concelebration. Each priest had to celebrate Mass on his own, very often without a congregation. And there were scores of priests and cardinals, probably running into the hundreds. So that would require a certain amount of wine to be provided for each harvest for the year to come, but also, of course, for the banquets, which I mentioned a few moments ago. So here is just a thumbnail sketch of what the area close to Chateauneuf-du-Pape, the new Pope's palace, must have looked like in this was about the late 16th, early 17th century. Today, of course, we have the same view, but the castle itself has fallen into ruins. And again, the fate of the church in France has changed considerably. And during the Napoleonic period, at the end of the 18th century, under Napoleon, the troops and the people dismantled so many churches, convents, friaries, and monasteries in order to take away the stones, simply to build other buildings. But what links us now is the vineyard, which continues to produce these wonderful wines, such as the celebrated Chateauneuf-du-Pape. The town itself is a small, very, very, very small little village, and it's worth visiting when you go to Avignon. Even though the main castle has fallen into disrepair, the vineyards have now become a commercial industry, and a large number of farmers and producers continue to work on the same vines, many of which go back, of course, to the time of the Romans, not simply to the time of the popes at Avignon, because vines and the little plant itself can be propagated from one generation to the next. And the soil in this area of the south of France and Provence is what you want. It's relatively rocky, it's dry, which drives the roots way, way, way down to try and find whatever water they can find. So the climate in France is they have a certain amount of water during the winter and a much lesser amount during the summer. But of course, as you know, to produce wine, you need a constant supply of water throughout the year. So they seem to have that balance. It'll be interesting to see in a few centuries if global warming will change that. But for the moment, this is what we have. So unfortunately, as I say, the buildings have been destroyed. And again, as patrons of the arts, the Asian chapter is continuously supporting, and indeed is one of the most active of the chapters of the patrons of the arts at the Vatican museums. And although maybe not engaged in Avignon, nevertheless is doing such tremendous work preserving the works of art in Rome. Another view of the vineyards, and of course, this is the period we're in at the moment. This is just finishing harvesting. The harvesting takes place between September and October. And indeed, we've now moved into the harvesting of the olive, which takes place between November and early December. And of course, Chateauneuf-du-Pape is the most important of all the wines. And the appellation is given because it's basically produced in the old territories which were laid out and the vineyards planted by, or at least on the orders of Pope John the 22nd. So finally, it was decided that the popes would need to go back to Avignon. They couldn't, from Avignon to Rome. It was important for them to make their return to the shrine of Peter. And one of the people who decided this, indeed, was Saint Catherine of Siena. In our next slide, we'll see. Catherine came from Siena, at the town which, in fact, we hope to visit during our spring visit with the Asian patrons in 2022. Rome, seated in black on our right-hand side, is shown as a widow in mourning for the city, which has been bereft of the papacy. The monuments are no longer attended by the pilgrims. And it was into this world that St. Catherine came when she visited the Pope. And she asked the Pope to consider going back to Rome. She said that was the important place of our Christian faith. It was the place where Peter and Paul were martyred. And she said that it was important for the popes in future to be at the center of these shrines. And so the Pope decided to accept that pleading of St. Catherine, who spent 3 months in Avignon, talking to various cardinals, talking to various advisors, asking them. So Gregory, who's also French, decided that he would return to Rome. So he sailed from Avignon Avignon through to Marseille, and from Marseille, the Mediterranean port, he set off for Rome. And here we have a depiction of the Pope arriving in Rome from a contemporary manuscript. And on the left-hand side, we have some of the cardinals. And today we've over 220 cardinals, but in those days, usually there were only about maybe a dozen or less than 24 cardinals. And at the time, as we've seen, they were elected French and Italians. They were the ones who had the largest block or number of popes. And so we come to the end of our presentation. At the end of this period, the papacy was not out of the woods, because the papacy now fractured, because with the election of the next pope, some of the cardinals decided that he wasn't what they wanted, and they went to another place, to a town called Frondi, and they elected a second pope who was called an anti-pope. And now the church suddenly had two popes, but that is really for another day's talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Father Michael. I'm waiting for the video to be on for both of us, but I'll ask a question and then they can continue to feature you. Thank you for this fascinating tour, as well as the beautiful images of Avignon that we can see. And I particularly was chuffed at it because I've been there 18 years ago, and so the scenes are just as fresh as yesterday because nothing changes in Avignon too much. Okay, I have some questions coming in already, and some of the questions I had, you already answered it. So my question was, at that time, even though the Pope was based in Avignon and the seat of power, I'm not sure whether it was still in Rome, how does the power struggle go? I mean, the Pope makes all decisions, it doesn't matter which location it is, or the fact that he has to be in Avignon or in Rome to really have the central power. How did this power struggle allows him to move to Avignon and then have to move back to Rome? Was my interest, in this maybe political maneuvers the church has to go through.
Well, that's a very interesting question, and it's fascinating to try and work out why the popes have to be in one place or the other. And the reality, it doesn't matter where the popes are. They could go to the moon if they wanted. Their job, their task, if you like, is to represent Christ on earth and to teach the fundamental gospel message, which is found in the Bible. So that really is their point. I suppose what we've seen, though, is when the popes get too much involved in property and in owning possessions and in power, then it becomes corrupt. And that is one of the things that happened during this papacy. And fortunately, during the centuries, various Christians have reformed the church from one century to the next.
Thank you. Now, I have some question that came online, and then I'm going to give the chance to some of the group in Hong Kong to ask the question live, if Atta can organize it for us to show that. But let me just handle the question that came in live on the first come, first serve basis. The first question came from William Chang in Hong Kong, and he asked the question, is it true that the period of the Avignon papacy was generally considered controversial and significantly affected the papacy? Pope Clement V was a controversial figure, and soon after Avignon, wasn't there the Western Schism that saw multiple rival popes? This is from William Chang, Hong Kong.
Yes, that's absolutely true. It was a very controversial time because, first of all, the cardinals, when they tried to elect a successor to Pope Boniface VIII, who, if you like, was at loggerheads with King Philip the Fair of France, they couldn't decide on anybody, and eventually they went to elect Bertrand de Goth, who was the Archbishop of Bordeaux, who wasn't a cardinal and wasn't even present at the conclave in Perugia where the cardinals were meeting. So a delegation had to travel over to France, which took several weeks, if not months. Then they invited the new pope to accept his proposition to become Clement V, which he did. And as I mentioned then, Clement didn't feel comfortable going back to Rome because he didn't think it was a safe place. And King Philip said, this isn't the place for you. The Romans will eat you alive. So you're much safer within my territories. So that is the reason that they stayed there. But you're right, it was a controversial time. And because the power bloc continued to shift in favor of the French cardinals, because remember, every pope creates a group of new cardinals. So from that bunch of cardinals, his successor is going to be elected. So as the decades continued for the Avignon papacy in France, more and more Frenchmen were being elected and less Italians. So therefore, that's why everything was stacked in favor of France. And that's why it's a possibility that the papacy could have remained in France right to the present day if the decision had not been taken by Pope Gregory IX in the 1370s, the mid-1370s, when he left in 1376 to go back to Rome. And as I mentioned at the end, then some of the cardinals were unhappy with the election of Pope Urban VI because they felt they just didn't like him, and they decided they'd made a mistake, and they elected another pope who becomes, if you like, an anti-pope. Then we've two popes, and then later on, the church has to call a council, and a third pope is elected in the hopes that the other two would resign, and this third pope could become the legitimate pope. But in fact, that didn't work out, and that's why we have the Great Western Schism. But you're quite right, that will be something we'd have to talk about maybe in greater detail on another meeting.
Thank you. Well, I think this is stage for a third Netflix on the three popes then.
Exactly. The two popes, now we have the three popes. Brilliant.
Okay.
Good.
Now, the question comes from Joanne Fu, and she says that you mentioned how different our modern Pope Francis is compared to the grandeur and excesses of the medieval popes. What we have today is for far sure a simpler and more spiritual church, which is perhaps what God wills. But now instead of the Black Plague, we have the COVID pandemic. What do you think is the significance in any of the pandemic for the church and the papacy?
That's a very profound question. And in fact, that's the reason why I mentioned the Black Death during our talk, because it does bring everything to being contemporary. Everybody is suffering during this pandemic because we're not used to the whole of humanity being shaken and stirred by something which is way beyond our control. And scientists and medics are grappling to find vaccines and to find antiviral drugs which are going to help us into the future. But I think the fundamental question is something that the World Health Organization has continuously said from the very beginning of the pandemic, that unless everybody is given what necessary medication they need, whether that be a vaccine or an antiviral or whatever particular care is going to be, until everybody has free access to that, the world itself is going to suffer. And that's one of the messages that Pope Francis has been very eloquent about. He speaks in very down-to-earth metaphors for us to understand. And I think that's something that we're continuously learning during this time of pandemic, that if we continue to be selfish and to store up all our doses and give ourselves booster and jab after jab, the pandemic is only going to mutate and continue. So it requires from the world a completely different change. And this is, of course, to my mind, where the Christian message can be so potent. And remember the words of Christ, whatever you do unto others, you do unto me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Father Michael. It's a tough one, that one. Now, I'm going to hand over the session and give a chance to those in Hong Kong who's having the wine dinner now. And we're featuring there. And so, Ben, you're there. I think I can't see them all. So can you just moderate a few and just assign maybe two or three on that question that's there, and Father Michael can answer directly. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Richard, and thanks, Father Michael, for that wonderful presentation. Yeah, we have about 30 people here, and if any one of you here has any questions, perhaps Father, we can post that direct to Father Michael, and we do have one, and come along here, Rob. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Can you hear me?
I can indeed, thank you. Hello from Ireland.
Thank you. I was just going to ask, you mentioned that 1/3 of the people in Europe were eliminated by the plague. And I was thinking of the role of the church, and particularly the role of the church in many poor parts of the world. Can the church serve as a means, as a platform for the distribution of vaccines? Because, one of the big controversies, as you mentioned, is that the vaccines are actually in rich countries, and that the vast majority of poor people have no access to it. So could the church play a role in providing a platform for distribution of vaccines to poor countries where you're already placed?
Yes, that is a very interesting proposal, very important proposal. I entirely agree with you.
Pass that on to the Pope for me.
Okay, that'll be a hard one. Try and get through to him. I think he's in Cyprus at the moment, but we'll see if we can get through to him. But no, that's a very interesting thing. And in fact, just a few days ago, we had International AIDS Day, HIV Care Day, and I read somewhere that 1/4 of people living with HIV are cared for by Catholic medical institutions, which is, pretty impressive. But there's two things that I would just make an answer to you maybe in what you say, and I think it's a very good point. First of all, it's interesting to see that the Church, the Catholic Church, and indeed all religions really, but the Catholic Church in particular, has, because we're talking about the Catholic Church today, has involved itself in social media and is trying effectively to get the message out. And one of the great messages, of course, is to try and convince people, and even if you only convince 1 or 2 people, that this is the route to go, and 1 or 2 people could make that great impact. And that's why we have an Irishman called Mike Ryan, who is a spokesman for the World Health Organization. He's a doctor, very highly regarded. He's very eloquent, and he keeps on driving home the message that until everyone is given the opportunity for some medication or care, whatever form it's going to be, nobody is going to be safe. And I think it's a very good idea that the churches indeed could. And this is one of the important things that I've been talking about the Avignon papacy as if it was really just a money spinning operation. I think that's not fair to say, because it kept the role of the church continuing. And it's like a painting by Caravaggio. There's always going to be the light and the dark parts. And I think this was, to be quite fair, the artwork may have been quite impressive, but it wasn't a very noble period for the church. But I think in today's world, this is something that the Catholic Church can contribute to enormously, because we are involved in a huge number of charities. And it's true what you say, we could be a great base for the distribution and the dissemination of good information to help people make up their minds.
Thank you.
All right. Any more questions from our friends in Hong Kong? In the group there?
Yeah, we do have one more.
All right, Ben, go ahead.
I'll go first and then Stuart.
Introduce your name and a question, please.
Yeah, no, I'm curious who owns the vineyards now after they got destroyed.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Yes, who owns the vineyards now after they got destroyed?
Well, they were all bought privately. They were confiscated, obviously, during the Napoleonic period, because if you ever want to know in France what was the big earthquake, the big schism period, it was at the end of the 18th, at the turn of the 19th century. So everything that belonged to the church was confiscated by the state. And it's quite interesting. Just take, for example, Notre Dame, which burnt down was damaged by fire a couple of years ago. The responsibility for the care of Notre Dame is in the hands of the state, because they, if you like, are the owners of the building, even though the church has constant use of it. But all of those buildings were confiscated by the state at the end of the 18th into the turn of the 19th century, just to make it simple. So therefore, all the vineyards were put into private hands. So some, I believe, are in the hands of families for generations, and others have been sold commercially. But it's quite a difficult thing to get the appellation Chateauneuf-du-Pape. You've got to go through a certain amount of etiquettes and exams and proofs of the origin of the vine, etc. So nowadays, most of it is in commercial hands.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from Hong Kong? Allow a last one before I take it back, and then handle some questions that come from the internet.
Yeah, I do have a question.
Okay, last one.
Yes, I would like to know, was there other options for the Pope at that time besides Avignon, and what was the reason they decided on Avignon but not others?
Yes, there would have been different options. I'm sure if King Philip had had his way, he might like to have installed the Pope in some other dominion, because curiously, Avignon was not entirely French. It was owned by Queen Joanne of Naples. So the popes actually had to purchase the city of Avignon. So it was just, they needed to settle somewhere. Pope Clement V spent 4 years between 1305 to 1309 trying to work out where he'd go and have his residence. But once they plonked themselves in a place, once they settled in a place, they decided to stay. And then once they started, of course, putting the money into the building of a palace, which was very much a fortress palace, it was such a big area, and it was decorated by the great artists of the day. They didn't see any purpose of traveling anywhere else. And that's why I say it could have been, if history had taken a different turn, it could be that instead of going to Rome with the Asian patrons of the arts for the Vatican museums, we'd be going to Avignon every year. Who knows?
Okay, thank you, Father. Now I have a question online. The person is not named, so unfortunately I can't give you the recognition. The question is, did the Catholic Church profit significantly and commercially from wine production in the Avignon region? And how did this region influence wine production in France in the future years or the years ahead?
Well, to the first part of the question, I wouldn't think that the church would have profited very much, because the church was using the vineyards very simply to produce the wine which was needed both at the masses, clearly, but equally for the great banquets that I mentioned a few moments ago. And if you see in, I think it was 1324, Pope John the 22nd had a big banquet at which 11 barrels of wine were consumed during one dinner. Can you imagine? So they must have been producing quite a lot. But then significantly afterwards, no, I don't think the papacy has had any other connection with the wine. It still uses the coat of arms, etc. But that, I think, to a certain degree, is almost for the publicity. But there's no link or connection anymore with the church and the wine.
Okay, thank you. Now, I have this question for you, Father, and it may be a bit pointed, I guess, and it's not easy. You know, in the patron of the arts for the Vatican Museum, we are asked to donate to the work, to restore work in Avignon, in this particular case, in the Chateauneuf-du-Pape. Now, how do we send a message out when, you know, we have to restore years of decadence, essentially, you know, the extravagance of the Pope? What's the lesson that we want to teach? Is it meant to teach a lesson? Is for us to remember history that is not so good for the church? What do you say to some who would question, how do we raise money when it was all about an aspect of the church that was not following the footstep of Jesus?
Totally, yeah. Well, first of all, that I agree entirely. But just to say, the patrons of the arts are not involved with Avignon at all, because Avignon does not belong to the Vatican or the Holy See, the papacy. That was confiscated, as I say, during the Napoleonic period. So we have no connection with Avignon. So there's no possibility of even looking after the artwork there. In actual fact, I'd argue that the French government has done a really bad job, because first of all, they allowed all the frescoes fall off the walls or disintegrate. Secondly, they allowed all the furniture to be confiscated and to be taken by people. So it's all gone. If you enter the palace today, you're given an iPad and you point your iPad to the empty rooms and there's absolutely no furniture there. So it's really disappointing. If I was in charge, I think I'd try and get some either replicas made of what the place looked like during the 14th century, or I try and buy back some of the original furniture if it's still available. But let's move to Rome and we can make the same comparison there. And we can say, look at the Sistine Chapel. That was built and decorated at a period when you had popes going off to wars, living licentious lives. Think in particular of Pope Alexander the Sixth, who was pope between 1492 and 1503, with his son Cesare Borgia and his other children. It was a dreadful time for the papacy, really an appalling time, and yet it produced great work. And the artworks which we still see and which are preserved at the Vatican museums, they inspire people as well, because these were the thoughts and the visual depictions made by some of the greatest hands in the world: Michelangelo, Raphael, Botticelli, Perugino, Ghirlandaio, just a few of the names, Bernini, Borromini, Maderno. All of these great names contributed to the beautification of the Vatican, which was, after all, built over the shrine of the place where St. Peter was reputed to have been martyred. So I accept your point completely and I agree with it. But at the same time, these are great works of art. And I think it's incumbent on us, if we can, and if we have the means, and if we have the love of art, which we as patrons do, we will want to do that, to pass it on to the next generation.
Okay, Father Michael, thank you so much for, ever fascinating talk, and especially the Q&A from the audience. I think it was varied, it was insightful, and it was interesting, and it stirs a lot of discussion and thought process. And we enjoyed it thoroughly. I enjoyed it particularly, and I will see Avignon from a different light, even though I've been there myself. So, Father, thank you again for that. Now, for everybody who's online, there's a part that I like to now take you to, which is to introduce Mr. Ben Chang. Ben, you have heard him a little bit on Voice, and you see a part of him. He is now, of course, in Hong Kong hosting the dinner, but he's the chairman of the Asian Patron of the Arts in the Vatican Museum, and he has a pre-recorded message for us because he couldn't do it while he's drinking, I guess, and enjoying himself. But Ben, over to you, where we have a chance to hear you on this pre-recorded message.
My dear patrons and friends, allow me to say how very delighted I am for this opportunity to address such a large and diverse audience of patron benefactors, not just from Asia, but from Europe and the United States. We have had tremendous interest from the patrons community in this lecture series with over 400 registrants. I sincerely want to thank you all for supporting APAVM and attending this fascinating 5-part Faith, Art and Wine lecture series. In September 2018, in a private audience with Pope Francis, the Holy Father's message to us, the 25 chapter leaders of the patrons of the arts in the Vatican museums, resonated with me, akin to a spiritual calling, which I think too is a calling to you all. Pope Francis's message, I would like to read it out to you. Throughout history, art has been second only to life in bearing witness to the Lord. It was and remains a majestic road, allowing us, more than by words and ideas, to approach the faith, because it follows the same path of faith, that of beauty. The beauty of art enriches life and creates communion, not just for the rich, but more so for the poor, not just to Christians, but to all peoples of all faiths, because it unites God, men, and creation in a single symphony. It connects the past, the present, and the future, and it attracts in the same place and with the same gaze, different and far off peoples. And so, my dear friends and patrons, today I appeal to you all to join us as patrons or friends of APAVM in our mission to promote, to preserve, and to restore the priceless treasures of art and architecture in the Vatican museums. This we do for our children and our future generations. With 19 museums, 54 galleries, and over 1,400 rooms, the Vatican Museums is the oldest and most diverse museum in the world. Founded in 1506, when Pope Julius II put Michelangelo and Raphael to work painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and the papal apartments. At about the same time, Donato Bramante designed and built the masterpiece of Renaissance architecture with its crowning jewel,
the Bramante courtyard. Over hundreds of years, the Bramante courtyard has suffered much damage from exposure to the elements and has been badly in need of restoration to bring this historical edifice back to its fundamental state of beauty as Bramante himself had intended. Patron chapters all over the world in the past few years have been working together to raise 7.7 million euros that is needed for the Bramante courtyard project, and it is due to be completed by early 2023. APAVM too is doing its part, and we have pledged €500,000, and we are still in need for further 200,000 to fulfill this obligation. In conjunction with this Faith, Art and Wine lecture series, I am today pleased to announce an online art silent auction of 33 fine pieces of art donated by Father Joseph Tam, Tan Lim Heng, and Delma Atelier. All proceeds from this silent auction, which will run all of December until the end of the year, will go towards the Bramante courtyard restoration project. And more information on the silent auction and the Bramante courtyard will be sent to you via email in the next few days. I do ask you all for your generosity to contribute to this Bramante courtyard project. Please do go to our silent auction website and do bid for your favorite piece of art. My heartfelt thanks to all of you for your support of APAVM. Do enjoy the next two remaining lectures of this most illuminating and outstanding lecture series. And may hope, peace, and love fill your home and fill your hearts during this blessed Advent season. And my very best wishes to you and your families for a joyful and holy Christmas and a happy, safe, and healthy New Year. Thank you all so much. God bless.
Thank you, Ben. And if you are interested, members of the audience, to be a part of the APAVM, then scan the following QR code to be a patron or a friend. Next week is another very interesting topic, Monks on a Mission, featuring Thomas William. And I was particularly intrigued by this one because I thought, Christianity came to America via the pilgrims on the east, and now we're going to talk about wines from Napa Valley and Sonoma County on the west. So I'll be very interested to see how Thomas William explained how the monks brought the wine to California. So with that as the ending, I'd like to thank the patron and the guests from all around the world for attending today's event. And thank you, Father Michael, again, for speaking to us on Pope Clement V and the wines of the Chateauneuf-du-Pape. YouTube links will be sent to you if you wish to watch again, members of the audience. Any question you feel that was not answered, and I only saw one or two, will be forwarded to Father Michael for his reply to you directly. Thank you, Asia chapter of the Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican Museum, for your general sponsorship for today's event. I look forward to seeing you next Saturday. And also, with that, I wish you all adios and God bless you and have a lovely weekend ahead of you. Thank you all.